Hello, today we're going to be talking about glaze basics. So what is glaze? You might be wondering. It's definitely different than paint. Glaze is made up of glass-forming materials, silica melted with fluxes and stabilized with alumina. Many of our glazes are, well, all of them are non-toxic when fired, and they are food safe. Again, they have to be fired first. When they're unfired, they can be hazardous when inhaled or digested. So you want to keep your glazes somewhere safe, and you also want to keep your containers closed because they can dry out. They work best in a liquid form. We have some different types of glaze that we use in the studio. We have matte and glossy glazes. So you might have seen when you were choosing your glazes, you had the choice of something that was more matte, like this black, and it feels a little bit more dry to the touch, or something that has more of a sheen to it. You can see the light reflecting off of this sun yellow. So there can be different reasons for choosing matte and glossy. Oftentimes matte glazes are better for something sculptural, although they can add some contrast to a shiny glaze. So the way that this person here used shiny glazes throughout, and then they used the matte black to create contrast and emphasis on the bird and on this woven detail. Matte glazes are often best used not used on functional work. So if you were going to drink out of something, a matte glaze is going to be a little bit harder to clean and keep stain free. We also have some different opacities. Opacities refers to the amount of light you can see through something. Some of our glazes are very solid. So for instance, if you look at the texture on this test tile, you can't really see it very well under the blue. This is a mostly opaque glaze, right? We might say this is semi-opaque. You can see through it a little bit. Whereas this glaze has a little bit more translucency to it. You can see the texture underneath a little bit more. So you might say that this has more translucency to it. Okay, so translucency refers to a glaze that kind of is tinted with a color, but you can still see through it quite a bit. This one I would say is fully translucent. You can really see everything through it. This is the sun yellow. Okay, so if you had any detail underneath, you would 100% see it. So many glazes kind of are either translucent or fully opaque or somewhere in between. So it's important to know the difference and to be able to choose the best application. If you want to be able to see through a glaze, knowing when to use it versus wanting something more opaque. So for instance, this person used the sun yellow on their flowers, and because it's translucent, you were really able to see through to the details underneath, like these orange stripes that they added. So they painted the yellow right over those little details, and the details pop through, and a little hint of yellow is added to them as well. All right, whereas the blue, a little bit more opaque, can't see through it as much. In the next video, I'm going to show you some different application methods, so we're going to skip over that for today. A few things I want to talk to about choosing your glaze. You should always look at the test tile, so you might want to refer back to those test tiles in the Google form. The test tiles have been tested in 3 different applications. Most people find that they like 3 coats the best to bring out the color. If your glaze is really thin, you may need to do additional coats beyond 3 coats. If you put on too many coats, what can happen is the glaze can drip off of the piece or even bubble up. So it's best to not go too overboard. You can tell how much glaze you've put on because you can take a paper clip and you can scratch the piece. And it should be about the thickness of a playing card. So I'm going to grab a paper clip. And I have a piece right here. Just going to move some things around. So here's a piece that I painted previously, and if I'm not sure how thick I've made the glaze, I can take and scratch it with a paper clip, and my camera's not focusing very well, but it should look about the thickness of a playing card. And then I can either paint over that area or just kind of rub it together, and it should just melt. Okay. So make sure you read your containers. Every container has been labeled with the glaze name on it. So make sure you're reading your labels because the glaze looks very different than how it looks in the jar. So for instance, this color, this purpley color ends up turning this deep blue. It has colorants in it that really come out when it gets fired to a high temperature. So what you get in your container typically looks nothing like the end product. So that's why it's important to read, go back and look at the tiles, make sure you read the labels and that you're using the proper material. And that you want to put the general 3 coats on it so that it gets a really nice, strong color and look. If you don't put enough coats on it, it can look streaky. In terms of color combinations, I've mentioned this before, analogous colors, those are the colors next to each other on the color wheel, those tend to look great for layering. So for instance, this person on their leaves used a light green and a dark green layered together and they kind of melted into each other. White, you can kind of add anything on top of white and it typically looks good. If you want to use colors that are opposite on the color wheel, I recommend either putting them side by side or one on the inside, one on the outside. As you can see here, we've got this kind of orangey yellow with the complementary blue, and it really looks great. If you try to layer a blue on top of a yellow or an orange, it could result in a muddy look because the colors melt into each other. So usually I would recommend doing some kind of test beforehand. You also should consider the function of the work. So matte glaze may be preferred for sculptural work, as I said, or the outside of a cup. Glazes are expensive, so try not to waste it. If you finish using your color, just save it. You may use it down the road for another project. If your work has any dust on it or debris, you should definitely give it a wipe down with a clean sponge, but you don't want to soak your artwork because then it will not accept glaze. It will be too water laden. You must glaze on fired work. You cannot glaze on something that hasn't been fired, so you couldn't glaze on your animals until they get fired. Okay. You want to keep lotion, lip gloss, and other products away from bisqueware because it could interfere with the glaze and cause areas where the glaze just will not stick. You do not need to glaze the bottom of your piece. In fact, it's much easier for me if you do not glaze it because it will stick to the kiln shelf and I have to put it on a special stilt. However, you can glaze the bottom. If you had feet on your piece, much like you see on mine, you could glaze all inside of here. You just should not glaze this part of the foot. That's what's going to be touching the kiln. And the same thing goes for a foot ring. You could glaze on the inside here, but you should not glaze the actual foot. If you put glaze on the piece and it's not put on stilts, it could stick to the kiln shelf. So if it's really thick on the bottom too, you may need to wipe it a little bit. You can always wash the glaze off with a sponge, a clean sponge. And it's good to have a container of water while you're glazing too and have a clean sponge. Like the little sponge I gave you would be fine. Small streaks from glaze will smooth out. You might notice the glaze looks a little chalky when it goes on, but again, little paintbrush pieces like hairs, those will all burn out. We typically don't reglaze things in class because it can cause further cracking or issues, so try to really get it right the first time. Make sure you are shaking or mixing your glazes. So if you've got one of these containers, you might want to take a fork or your skewer and really mix it up good. You want it to be about the thickness of one of those yogurt drinks. So it should, like a milkshake consistency, I suppose, is what you're looking for. Lastly, you should document your colors. So I always recommend that you make a quick drawing of your piece, which you should all have already in your sketchbook somewhere, and write down the colors you used. Why? Why should you do that? Well, it's good to have a record because you might try out a really cool technique and you're not going to get these back for a little while. You might forgot how you did it, right? And you might want to be able to repeat what you did. So for instance, if I did some sponging or whatnot, so I would write that here. Inside, I poured clear glaze. Here I put down 2 coats of peach F54. So you should write the name and number of the glaze you used and how you applied it. And then here I wrote that I sponged on top with plum blush. So again, you should make a small drawing of your piece and then write down what you did and how you did it. And that will also help you from day to day knowing, oh yeah, I need to add one more coat here. Which on a day to day, it might not be a big deal to remember, but when you come back a week from now and try to remember, it might be difficult. Those of you coming to class may get to use some of the glazes in the bottle, and these typically have all of the information you need. It tells you if it's semi-translucent, it has a number and a name associated with it. You also need to give these a really good shake. But during COVID and trying to keep things as kind of germ-free as possible, most likely we'll be working out of these. So keep them sealed up, keep them in your Ziploc bag, and just put them someplace safe.